Everyone assumes a strait is closed only when warships physically seal it. However, the Strait of Hormuz can be locked long before a formal blockade is declared, and that is exactly the contradiction now shaking global markets. The narrow waterway between Iran and Oman remains technically open, yet captains are delaying sailings, insurers are repricing risk by the hour, electronic interference is disrupting navigation, and governments from Washington to Tokyo are treating a few miles of sea as the pressure point of the entire world economy. The most important detail is not whether Tehran has signed a document saying the channel is shut. The most important detail is that fear, missiles, mines, and uncertainty are already doing the work of closure. In June 2025, the Joint Maritime Information Center reported that Iran's parliament had approved a motion to close the strait after U.S. strikes on nuclear facilities at Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordow, while the final decision rested with Iran's Supreme National Security Council. Yet in the same advisory, traffic was still flowing. That paradox is the crisis. A passage can remain legally open and become strategically unusable. And when the world's energy artery enters that gray zone, the consequences reach far beyond the Gulf. The images surrounding this crisis tell the story with brutal clarity. Tankers stack up near approach lanes, congestion builds off Dubai and in the southern Gulf of Oman. Merchant crews choose daylight transits because night magnifies the danger. Navigation systems face persistent GNSS interference, with British-linked maritime reporting noting signal disruption associated with the Bandar Abbas area. That matters because modern shipping does not collapse only under missile impact. It can also seize up through degraded confidence, disrupted routing, and the growing suspicion that every radar return may be a fast inshore attack craft. Every shoreline shadow may conceal an anti-ship battery, and every delay may become a commercial catastrophe. What viewers are seeing is not a cinematic exaggeration. It is the transformation of maritime uncertainty into geopolitical leverage. When even a partially disrupted transit corridor forces global operators into caution, rerouting, and hesitation, the strategic effect begins before the first decisive naval order is ever issued. The immediate chain of events moved with remarkable speed. After U.S. strikes hit 3 Iranian nuclear sites over a weekend in June 2025, regional signaling shifted from deterrence to brinkmanship. The Joint Maritime Information Center assessed the maritime threat level as significant and the shipping risk environment as elevated. It also noted that June 2025 averaged roughly 114 vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz each day, a reminder that this corridor is not symbolic geography. It is a living conveyor belt of oil, gas, chemicals, containerized trade, and strategic credibility. The U.S. Energy Information Administration describes the strait as one of the world's most important oil chokepoints. In 2024, approximately 20 million barrels per day moved through Hormuz, equal to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption, more than 1/4 of total global seaborne oil trade, and around 1/5 of global LNG trade. More than 80% of those crude and LNG volumes were destined for Asian markets, especially China, India, Japan, and South Korea. That means a crisis in these waters is never just about Iran and the United States. It instantly becomes a test of Asian energy security, European inflation resilience, American naval credibility, and the survival instincts of every Gulf exporter whose economy depends on open sea lanes. And the most dangerous part comes next, because geography gives Iran multiple ways to threaten traffic without needing to win a conventional naval battle. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 22 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, with shipping lanes that compress traffic into a predictable corridor. For military planners, that geography invites asymmetric warfare. Iran does not need to sink a supertanker every hour to create strategic paralysis. It needs only to convince ship owners that the probability of one catastrophic strike has become unacceptable. Congressional Research Service analysis has long emphasized that Iran can disrupt shipping with mines, speedboats, submarines, shore-based cruise missiles, aircraft, and other systems. Open-source estimates cited by CRS have placed Iran's naval mine inventory above 5,000 and in some assessments closer to 6,000. Those mines are not a single category. Limpet mines attach to hulls. Moored mines wait below the surface for contact. Bottom mines rest on the seabed and detonate when acoustic, magnetic, or pressure signatures suggest a target overhead. Mine warfare is slow, patient, and psychologically devastating. It transforms every commercial transit into a gamble and every minesweeping operation into a race against fear. Then come the missile systems. Iran has invested for years in layered anti-access and area denial architecture along its coast and islands. That architecture includes anti-ship cruise missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles, mobile launchers, drone reconnaissance, and overlapping radar coverage designed to threaten commercial and military vessels in confined waters. The significance of shore-based anti-ship fires is simple. A launcher hidden inland does not need to dominate the sea. It only needs a firing solution and enough survivability to keep insurers, naval commanders, and shipping consortia guessing. Add fast inshore attack craft from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, and the tactical picture becomes more dangerous. Swarming tactics force escorts to divide attention between missiles from the shore, drones overhead, possible mine-laying activity, and small craft that can close distance quickly in cluttered waters. Even if such craft never achieve a decisive hit, they complicate rules of engagement, consume defensive munitions, and keep commercial masters under constant pressure. Submarines deepen the problem. A submarine in the Strait of Hormuz does not require blue water dominance to be effective. In narrow, crowded waters, even a limited undersea threat magnifies uncertainty for every merchant bridge team and every escort commander. Electronic warfare compounds it further. The Joint Maritime Information Center's reporting on elevated GNSS interference is not a side note. It means the battle space is not only physical, it is electromagnetic. If navigation quality deteriorates while threat reporting intensifies, convoys slow, waiting patterns expand, and the risk of collision or misidentification grows. This is where the crisis stops being a headline and becomes a systems battle. Oil tankers, insurers, Navy task groups, port operators, commodity traders, and political leaders are all reacting to the same question: can the corridor still be trusted? We will return to that question in a moment, because the answer determines whether this becomes a contained regional shock or the opening chapter of a wider economic confrontation. Consider the operational sequence that would follow even a limited Iranian attempt to tighten control over Hormuz. First, commercial operators would request updated threat assessments from naval coordination centers. Then insurers would revise war risk premiums, sometimes before governments release formal statements. Next, charterers would hesitate to fix voyages into loading terminals inside the Gulf unless freight rates rose enough to compensate for danger. Finally, naval forces would have to decide whether they were merely monitoring, escorting, or actively preparing to clear mines and suppress missile batteries. Each of those steps consumes time. Each minute of hesitation reduces throughput, and in a market built on continuous flow, delay itself becomes a weapon. This is why mine countermeasures matter so much. Clearing a suspected mined corridor is not a matter of sending one ship forward and declaring the lane safe. It demands sonar search patterns, explosive ordnance disposal teams, unmanned systems, helicopters in some cases, meticulous route verification, and repeated confirmation, because one missed contact can destroy confidence in the entire operation. Anti-submarine screening must run at the same time. Air defense watches cannot relax. Surface escorts must still guard against swarming craft. In military language, the defender faces a saturation problem. He is not confronting one threat axis. He is confronting several, compressed into a narrow transit geometry where merchant vessels cannot maneuver like warships. The islands and coastal sites overlooking the waterway magnify that pressure. Missile units positioned on Iranian territory or nearby islands do not need to sortie far from support infrastructure. They can exploit hardened positions, mobile relocation, decoys, and the clutter of coastal terrain. Drones can extend surveillance. Civilian traffic can complicate identification. Shore radar can hand off targeting data. And every time a launcher disappears from one location, escorts must assume it may reappear somewhere else along the chain. This is the essence of anti-access warfare in literal space. It is inexpensive compared with the value of the ships being threatened, and it forces technologically superior opponents into constant defensive expenditure. That dynamic explains why even states that dislike one another suddenly share a common interest in de-escalation when Hormuz becomes unstable. China wants energy continuity. India wants predictable import costs. Japan and South Korea need uninterrupted LNG and crude flows. Gulf monarchies need export revenue and investor confidence. Europe wants lower inflation risk. The United States wants freedom of navigation to remain credible. Those interests overlap, but they do not align perfectly, and Tehran understands that fragmented priorities can slow collective action. The longer uncertainty persists, the more every government is tempted to seek a private arrangement, a temporary exemption, or a narrow diplomatic off-ramp. That temptation is itself part of the pressure campaign. And if one transit fails spectacularly, the queue behind it becomes a floating monument to vulnerability, visible to satellites, markets, ministries, and every nervous household on Earth. At the strategic level, Hormuz is not merely a strait. It is the release valve of the Persian Gulf energy system. Saudi Arabia alone accounted for roughly 38% of total Hormuz crude and condensate flows in 2024, around 5.5 million barrels per day, according to the EIA. Qatar's LNG exports rely heavily on the same maritime outlet. Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran itself are tied to this artery in different ways. There are bypass options, but they are limited. The EIA estimates that Saudi and Emirati pipelines could provide roughly 2.6 million barrels per day of spare bypass capacity in a disruption, a meaningful figure yet nowhere near enough to replace the approximately 20 million barrels per day that moved through the strait in 2024. Iran's Gorejsk line offers only modest alternative export capacity and has been used far below its theoretical potential. In other words, there is no serious substitute for Hormuz at scale. That is why even temporary disruption ricochets across futures markets, freight rates, and strategic reserves. This is also why the phrase lockdown is more analytically useful than closed. A formally closed strait suggests a legal declaration and a visible barrier. A lockdown strait describes the commercial reality in which movement becomes restricted by danger, delay, intimidation, or unacceptable insurance cost. CSIS has warned that when shipping through Hormuz is disrupted or halted, major powers across Asia feel the shock almost immediately. China may hold larger stockpiles than some neighbors, but it still depends on Gulf flows. Japan and South Korea face acute import vulnerability. India's exposure is structural. Once marine war risk premiums spike, chartering becomes harder, timing windows narrow, and the knock-on effects spread into refining margins, petrochemical chains, aviation fuel, and consumer inflation. That is why crises in narrow waterways often punish states far from the first shot. There is another layer here, and it concerns military signaling. If Tehran can create a condition in which maritime traffic technically continues, but the world treats every transit as an emergency evolution, then Iran achieves coercive leverage without crossing every threshold that would unify a maximal international response. It can test reactions, observe convoy behavior, measure Western caution, and study Asian diplomatic pressure. For Washington and its partners, the dilemma is equally severe. Overreact, and they risk rapid escalation with a state that can still lash out through missiles, drones, proxies, and cyber operations. Underreact, and they allow the precedent that a revisionist regional power can throttle a global chokepoint through calibrated menace. That dilemma is the heart of the strategic contest. The contest is not only over water, it is over who defines acceptable risk in the central artery of the energy economy. Geopolitically, the crisis radiates across several concentric circles. The first circle is the Gulf itself, where exporters must reassure markets while quietly testing emergency routing, air defense readiness, and port resilience. The second circle is Asia, where import-dependent economies track every tanker movement because 84% of Hormuz crude and condensate and 83% of LNG moved to Asian markets in 2024. The third circle is Europe, which may import less directly through the strait than Asia, but still absorbs price shock through global benchmarks, industrial energy costs, and shipping markets. The fourth circle is the United States. Direct U.S. dependence on Persian Gulf crude shipped via Hormuz has fallen sharply. The EIA says the United States imported only about 0.5 million barrels per day through the corridor in 2024, around 7% of U.S. crude and condensate imports and 2% of petroleum liquids consumption. But that statistic can mislead. America may need less Gulf oil than in previous decades, yet the U.S. still has a massive interest in preventing the weaponization of maritime chokepoints because the price of energy is global, the credibility of naval guarantees is global, and alliance expectations are global. Historical memory also matters. Every major Hormuz scare revives comparisons with the tanker war of the 1980s, Operation Earnest Will, Operation Praying Mantis, and the persistent lesson that even a militarily inferior actor can exploit constrained waters to produce outsized strategic effect. Iran's strength in such a confrontation does not come from matching the United States ship for ship. It comes from geography, deniability, asymmetric doctrine, and the reality that commercial traffic hates uncertainty more than navies do. A carrier strike group can fight in ambiguity. A shipping board cannot. A destroyer commander can enter a threat envelope under orders. A private tanker operator must justify risk to financiers, shareholders, crews, and insurers. That difference is where Tehran searches for leverage. And once leverage exists, diplomacy changes. Beijing pressures for flow. Gulf capitals quietly calculate survivability. European governments warn against escalation. Every actor begins speaking the language of de-escalation while simultaneously preparing for a wider rupture. The psychological dimension is often overlooked, yet it is decisive. A maritime crisis is lived first by crews. It is the tanker master scanning the horizon at dawn, knowing a misread radar contact could become a fatal delay. It is the navigation officer coping with intermittent positioning reliability while traffic density increases. It is the escort commander weighing whether a small craft is routine harassment, ISR queuing, or the opening move of a swarm. It is the trader in Singapore or London watching freight spreads widen and realizing that a rumor from Bandar Abbas can shift billions of dollars in value before lunch. Strategic choke points are, in the end, human choke points. They compress time, options, and nerves. That is why even limited military signaling in Hormuz creates global emotional impact. People understand almost instinctively that this is one of the few places on Earth where a local clash can punch straight into the bloodstream of the world economy. For Iranian decision-makers, that psychology is part of the arsenal. Tehran knows that ambiguity can be more useful than a fully executed closure. A total blockade invites overwhelming retaliation and risks strangling Iran's own export routes. A controlled atmosphere of menace, by contrast, can preserve options. Parliament can approve a motion. Officials can issue calibrated warnings. Military units can posture. Electronic interference can persist. Shipping congestion can grow. Prices can rise. Foreign governments can call. In coercive strategy, that sequence is valuable because it generates pressure without immediately exhausting escalation ladders. Yet this is also the point at which coercion becomes unstable. If an overloaded merchant captain misreads instructions, if a nervous escort opens fire, if a mine breaks loose, if a missile battery receives faulty cueing, then deliberate pressure can become an uncontrolled war spiral in minutes. And that is the cliff edge now looming over the Gulf. Looking ahead, three broad scenarios define the next phase. In the first, the crisis remains in the gray zone. Traffic continues, but under heavy naval presence, elevated insurance cost, daylight preference, intermittent congestion, and a constant stream of maritime advisories. In the second, Iran escalates selectively by intensifying mine-laying, anti-ship missile signaling, drone surveillance, or harassment operations through IRGC naval craft, forcing organized convoy protection and more aggressive countermeasures by the United States and partners. In the third, a single successful strike or mining incident pushes markets into panic and compels a multinational effort to guarantee transit by force. None of these paths is cheap, none is stable, and all of them reveal the same underlying truth. The world built a critical share of its energy security around a corridor that can be threatened by a state using asymmetric tools far cheaper than the commodities moving through it. That is why this moment is bigger than a headline about Iran, bigger than a weekend of airstrikes, and bigger than a temporary spike in Brent. The contradiction from the opening remains the key to everything. The Strait of Hormuz does not have to be officially sealed to function like a locked gate. It only has to become dangerous enough, confusing enough, and expensive enough that global commerce begins to hesitate. That hesitation is already a strategic event. So the real question is no longer whether the waterway is open on paper. The real question is how long the international system can tolerate an energy artery that remains legally passable but operationally fragile. Tell us in the comments whether this crisis ends in deterrence, convoy warfare, or a negotiated climb down. If this analysis helped clarify the stakes, do not forget to subscribe and leave a like. The world was told the Strait of Hormuz was still open. The world is now discovering that open water can still be locked down. Presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.